Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar where we will be talking about opportunities in the Global Plastics Treaty for Asia and the Pacific, addressing plastic pollution for climate benefits. And this is part of the Circular Economy webinar series. We are on the 25th session. Congratulations to the Circular Economy team. They started the webinar series in June 2022. And just a couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to attend the fantastic training organized by the Circular Economy team. And it was great to learn about really very meaningful, impactful work that the team is doing, where there are benefits being generated at the local community level, focused on women, the disadvantaged groups, and also, of course, dealing with the issue of plastics itself and its impacts on biodiversity and the environment. So I'm really looking forward to continuing my learning journey and learning more today from the session today. And I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for today. His name is Rocky, Roger Joseph Guzman. We can call him Rocky. He's the International Governance Policy and Legal Specialist, and he's also a a consultant with the Climate Change and Sustainable Development Department. Rocky is an environmental lawyer and policy specialist with an extensive background on ocean issues. He has held positions in various nonprofits and international organizations where he led projects from marine conservation and plastic pollution to fisheries management and strengthening environmental rights. Rocky got his master's degree in environmental policy at Duke University, and he is also the deputy director of the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law, which is an NGO. So Rocky, I invite you to make the presentation. So we will have a presentation of about 20 minutes from Rocky, and then we will open the floor for Q&A, or if there are any comments from the audience, but please feel free to also post your questions and comments in the chat box as Rocky is making his presentation. Over to you, Rocky.
Thank you very much, Karma, for that kind introduction. Just confirming if you can see my screen. Yes?
Yes. You need to make it full screen though.
Sweet. All right. Thank you again, Karma. And it's really a great honor for me to be back here after a few months in this Circular Economy webinar series, speaking about a topic that is subject of much international scrutiny, but also concerted action among different countries across the world, the plastic pollution problem, as well as its interface with climate change. So for this session, I'm going to speak on the policy brief and the contents of the policy brief we just published with the TA under the SDCC on addressing plastic pollution for climate benefits and opportunities for the Global Plastics Treaty, or GPT, for Asia and the Pacific. Now, this is the policy brief. I hope the team can provide the link to the policy brief so you can check it out later. But just a background on the issue at hand. So the premise really here in this policy brief is that the global production and consumption of plastic is growing considerably and is actually projected to triple by 2060. So that's around 40 years from now. And this has led to excessive production and consumption of plastic. That's leading to major mismanagement and resulting to different issues such as marine debris and pollution in the oceans. Now, it's important to connect this and frame it in the issue and the narrative of climate change as well, because it's not being discussed as much, but actually, plastics generate a huge chunk of greenhouse gas emissions. Actually, in 2019, it was 1.8 billion metric tons, or up to 4% of the world's total GHG emissions. And that constitutes, and this is because 99% of plastics is actually made from chemicals obtained from fossil fuels. So this means that plastic pollution and climate change are necessarily intertwined, and they're closely linked as to investments and as well as their production processes. Now, with this premise, um, the projections show that by 2050, the combined greenhouse gas emissions from plastic are projected to surpass 56 gigatons. And in a business as usual scenario, this could contribute up to almost 20% of the global GHG emissions that are allowed within the carbon budget to stay within the 1.5 degrees Celsius goals and targets in the Paris Agreement by 2040. So it takes a considerable chunk in the carbon budget that's available. Now, I'm going to focus in this presentation and in the policy brief once you've got a chance to read it on the nexus and the interlinkages between plastics and climate change and to make it more clear to everyone. Now, if you look at the plastics pollution, the plastics industry, and it's important to look at the carbon footprint that it presents, right, at every stage of the life cycle. So from every stage, be it from extraction to production, distribution, packaging, all the way down to the end of life management, it contributes some it contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. Now for this presentation, I'm gonna put a spotlight on three major stages in the plastic life cycle where greenhouse gas emissions are emitted. The first one is in extraction and production processes. So this entails the energy consumed during the drilling process for oil or gas, being the material for the primary plastic polymer material as basis for these plastic resins, as well as emissions from fuel combustion. It's important to note that plastic refining is one of the most energy intensive processes for fuel. This includes cracking or polymerization to produce these plastic resins in the first place. Now, the second part is on the disposal and waste management going midstream, downstream. And the issues here include emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from incineration, and open burning of plastic waste. It contributes considerably to greenhouse gas emissions with some unsustainable practices which are not aligned with best available technology. So this has been presented as a main contributor as well to GHG emissions. Now the third one is on the plastic pollution in the environment already. So once mismanaged plastic waste goes to the river and all the way to the oceans, it could remain to the environment and it continues to have climate impacts. This is particularly important because even though there is only emerging research on this, there are studies that show that plastics, once in the environment and breaks down into fragments as microplastics, impacts the sequestration functions of these carbon feeding organisms, such as phytoplanktons and zooplanktons. And so it impacts their capacity to capture carbon in the first place. So it even has an impact way downstream, as you can see, from extraction, production, all the way to waste management. And once it stays in the environment, it has impacts and it could contribute to GHG emissions. So that's the life cycle and its contribution to GHG emissions in a nutshell. Now, I mentioned that climate change and plastic pollution is a huge issue that has been garnering a lot of attention and requiring concerted action across different countries. And it's actually happening right now, the discussions on having a global plastics treaty. You might have heard about the initiative that's happening. The Global Plastics Treaty, we are currently halfway through the process. This process, for context, started in 2022, where the UN Environment Assembly passed a resolution to have an internationally legally binding instrument, or ILBI, to combat plastic pollution and to have this finished in 2 years, which is at the end of 2024. So right now we are in the middle of the negotiating rounds. We have two more, next in Canada and the other one in Korea, to have a final draft treaty text that could be circulated for adoption by state parties next year in 2025 for implementation 2025 onwards. Now, if you look at the Global Plastics Treaty, as it stands, because it's currently being negotiated, there are some opportunities whereby plastic pollution interventions could be used as well to be strategies for climate change mitigation. The first one here is is mainstreaming circular economy through EPR, or what we call extended producer responsibility. Now, in a nutshell, EPR is a means whereby producers are held accountable for the whole life cycle of its plastics, including to making sure that the business model prolongs the lifespan of products and minimizing material production, thereby lowering greenhouse gas emissions. Through buyback provisions as well and deposit refund systems, they are able to prevent waste through this framework. The other opportunities include promoting reduction at source, and this could be done by addressing and regulating further non-essential, unnecessary, and problematic plastic products. This could include bans, moratoriums, limitations, and other uh, command and control tools that are being discussed during the treaty negotiations. The third is promoting low carbon energy use in plastic life cycle processes. As I've mentioned, especially in the production and extraction stages, it's highly energy extensive, so it would be a good opportunity to promote low carbon energy use in these stages. The next one is enhancing downstream waste management and recyclability. This would also be an opportunity to address some issues that are presented by waste management measures, such as incineration and open burning, that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. And lastly, also an opportunity to fortify the linkages between the climate change agreement, the Paris Agreement, as well as the plastics treaty, what will be the obligations that will be required of the global plastics treaty. So it's important to ensure national compliance, both toward ensuring combating plastic pollution goals, as well as change mitigation under the Paris Agreement. So those are some of the opportunities for change mitigation that are being discussed necessarily as part of this global plastics treaty discussions. Now, I'll go to some of the meat of the discussions now in the global plastics treaty. Um, by discussing all of this, I will be able to go through the discussions in the Global Plastics Treaty as to the contents. The first one is in the control measures, which are what you call the core obligations, whereby these are the regulations which our countries are bound to fulfill as part of the Global Plastics Treaty for implementation. The first bucket here is the upstream life cycle approaches, and this includes having interventions on primary plastic polymers, on problematic and avoidable products, as well as microplastics. Now, in this upstream life cycle stages, some of the interventions that are being discussed, some of the options that are being negotiated include having global targets based on baselines that are being developed as of now, having bans, for instance, limitations, and reductions in production. These are all hot button issues that are being negotiated by countries which have different interests, but it's all in the table. There are also proposals to establish criteria for unnecessary and avoidable plastic products to determine whether they are problematic in the first place, and having, for example, regulations for specific materials such as single-use plastics. Now, as I've said, where necessary, it would be good also to have the opportunity to establish low carbon target goals for production in this upstream life cycle part of the plastics life cycle and to align it with the Paris Agreement goals as well. An important intervention would also be addressing the issue of microplastics by adopting best available technology and environmentally sound practices as well to address this issue and to stem its leakage into the natural environment. Now, the second set of control measures focuses on the midstream life cycle of plastics. This looks at having EPR, as I've mentioned, strengthening product design, composition, and performance, as well as having more safe and sustainable substitutes that are non-plastic. This looks specifically also at EPR as one of the cornerstones of the control measures because effective EPR schemes hold producers and manufacturers responsible for the consequences of their products all the way throughout their life cycle. The discussions that are being held now include having guidance for EPR, and this includes a discussion whether how binding it might be. Would it be a mandatory EPR that would require all plastic producers in specific jurisdiction to be included within its remit? Or would it be more voluntary approaches, encouraging states and encouraging governments to have these producers within the EPR framework of their countries? So that's a discussion that's being done in the plastics treaty negotiations. But there's also discussions in the product design criteria as well. It's very important because product design would be essential to ensure that plastic products would be good or fit for reuse and recyclability. It would contribute to the growth of the recycling market later on, and it will also promote overall resource efficiency. As to non-substitutes, non-plastic substitutes, this could include promoting innovation and incentivizing the development of these sound, sustainable, and safe alternatives and substitutes to plastics. Now, the last set of control measures that are being discussed looks at the downstream part of the life cycle of plastics. This includes the three R's: reducing, reusing, and repair, waste management and having the infrastructure to do that, and of course, regulating the release of plastics and emissions to the environment. So this looks at really preventing the leakage of plastics into the marine environment, the rivers, all the way to waterways, all the way to the oceans, and to ensure that there are management practices and infrastructure in place that would ensure safe and sustainable management of plastic waste at different stages of the life cycle, especially downstream, their collection, recycling, and disposal. Now, this could also be an opportunity to address emissions from waste management by having stronger provisions and safeguards to address the issues posed by downstream waste management measures, such as incineration as well as open burning, and the harms that it poses. Now, I focus on the control measures there, and these are the core obligations, as I've mentioned, for countries to implement later on. But the other side of the global plastics treaty discussions looks at the implementation. And this is where ADB really comes in because as a financing institution, ADB is well positioned to provide the financing and technical assistance for countries to fulfill their obligations. Now, this looks at two strands within the implementation provisions. The first one is the means of implementation, which covers financing, capacity building, technical assistance, and technology transfer. Now, these refer generally to the essential resources and actions for countries to fulfill their obligations under the GPT. And the ADB can provide financing, technical assistance, all these to ensure that countries are ready to implement them once they are required to with the treaty in place. Now, we also have the implementation measures, which are the more tangible approaches that we can see that countries need to do to implement the provisions of the treaty. These include having national plans. It could be termed national action plans or national implementation plans that would catalyze the establishment of appropriate policy, legislative, and institutional frameworks for implementation. This would be complemented by national reporting mechanisms, compliance bodies, as well as measures to assess and monitor and evaluate all these implementation that is happening on the ground. Now, this is an important part of the Global Plastics Treaty, but as it relates to climate change as well, it's important to link the Global Plastics Treaty implementation with commitments under the Paris Agreement, especially towards investments and government action that deliver co-benefits to combat plastic pollution as well as mitigate climate change. Now, with those four slides, I've given a brief overview and a nutshell actually of what the contents might be and what's currently being discussed in the Global Plastics Treaty negotiations. Now, I focus on the potential ADB, the potential support opportunities for ADB to DMCs with all these in place and anticipating the Global Plastics Treaty would be adopted 2025 and implemented onwards. Now, some of an environmental policy tool that I mentioned repeatedly before is EPR. Now, this is a regulatory and financing mechanism that would provide regulation, control measure, as well as unlock finance for governments to use in other uses as well, including waste management infrastructure, because it holds producers accountable and gives the cost to the producers in ensuring that it gets the waste in the first place and it prevents waste from going to the environment through possibly buyback mechanisms or deposit refund systems. There is an opportunity for ADB to deliver policy support for EPR mechanisms. Currently, we have countries like Vietnam, where in 2020 they had already enacted an EPR legislation, as well as the Philippines in 2022. They enacted an EPR legislation which covers initially more larger scale companies and would be phased into more to other enterprises later on. Now, there's a great opportunity for ADB to support in the implementation here, to learn from the examples and experiences that are happening at this early stage, and to ensure effective and full implementation of EPR schemes to become an effective control measure as well as a financing mechanism. This could also include having enabling conditions for circular economy. For Thailand and Indonesia, for example, they have roadmaps for preventing waste, for ensuring proper waste management, includes EPR as one of the cornerstones of these roadmaps. For Indonesia in particular, they have the concept of EPR, for example, but it lacks teeth because it does not have the corresponding penalties. And that's also the opportunity to develop these EPR schemes further to ensure that they could be effective as a control measure as well as a financing mechanism. The second would be looking at innovative finance mechanisms. And what we've identified here, discussed also in the policy brief, is scaling up this concept of plastic credits. Now, plastic credits is an innovative finance mechanism whereby one credit is equivalent to a transferable unit of plastic that is actually recycled or collected from the environment. And this could be bought and sold within the credit market. Now, it's important to ensure to have the effective and full impact to standardize methodologies and to integrate safeguards in this process. By having these methodologies that are standard and having safeguards in place, we hit the issues that could impact, for example, the informal waste sector, gender issues, addressing the disparity of women within the informal waste market, all these things, and we address and we have specific provisions to ensure that they are respected and the methodologies address their specific issues. In the region, for example, there are early plastic credit models that we can look at, and it just needs more push and more support to scale them up. There are some in the Philippines and in Thailand, and it would be good for ADB as an opportunity to scale up these plastic credit schemes as one of the innovative finance mechanisms within the suite of finance options that are included and are being discussed within the plastics treaty narrative. And the last one is on where ADB could support is having more digital and supporting more digital and high level technology solutions for plastic waste management. This includes having digital solution support. ADB, for instance, through the TA has supported a tech-enabled deposit return refilling system that's been developed by an app developer, and this could be scaled up further. We have these opportunities to scale up these digital solutions. That would also contribute to the digital roadmaps of different countries to reduce plastic pollution. So all in all, these are three tangible recommendations and potential opportunities for support where ADB can come in once the GPT or even before the GPT comes in, but eventually through 2025 onwards, in line with the goals of the Global Plastics Treaty. Now, lastly, this part, I'd like to go to the financing role of ADB and where does ADB come in all of this conversation. So firstly, ADB can assist in the identification, preparation, and implementation of government and private sector actions and investments by providing the system for finance for GPT implementation, along with other multilateral development banks, as well as financing institutions, but also supporting the development of enabling conditions by the government to ensure the implementation of the Global Plastics Treaty mandates in the first place. And through all of this, it's important for ADB to uphold safeguards as well in accordance with ADB policies. Now, as to the financing role, ADB is in a position to build the next generation of investments that aligns with the Global Plastics Treaty and is a strategy as well for mitigation of climate change. This includes leveraging ADB's existing finance facilities. So here you can see some of the existing facilities that could be looked at to provide financing and safeguards for the mandates of the Plastics Treaty as well as climate change mitigation strategy. We have the Blue Sea Finance Hub in Southeast Asia, the Blue Pacific Finance Hub, the ACGF or in the ASEAN, SME Blue Impact Asia, as well as ORCA or the Ocean Resilience and Coastal Adaptation Financing Facilities. So all of these are already existent and could be used to leverage further for finance. There could also be occasion to attract more private sector investment once the Global Plastics Treaty is in place. We could leverage this to attract more private sector investment. And related to this, ADB could also scale up and support more blue loans towards circular economy goals. Blue loans are already have already been extended, for example, to recycling facilities, PET recycling bottles facilities in Indonesia, to the PD Alba company, as well as in Indorama across different countries in South and Southeast Asia. Now, all of this, it will be also important to enhance the criteria for project assessment as well as due diligence as well. So this includes ensuring that this aligns with the Ocean Finance Framework, where circular economy is part of the typologies for investments that would be included. So it's good to align this with the Ocean Finance Framework safeguards and policies and methodologies for project assessment for these projects within the ocean space in the blue economy. Now, I conclude here by saying that really circular economy is key to mitigating climate change, and it's important to draw attention and putting a spotlight in this nexus here between climate change and plastic production as well as pollution. And in the preparation for implementation of the Plastics Treaty 2025 onwards, ADB can definitely support in policy and investment by identifying and supporting investment areas and supporting enabling conditions or these national frameworks on circular economy that would hit two stones, both combating plastic pollution as well as mitigating climate change. All in all, sustainable finance is key to facilitating policy reform, projects, and technologies to advance circular economy solutions, and ADB is in a position to support implementation through financing, and this would necessarily address the finance gaps that are present in climate change and plastic pollution spaces. So I will end here, Karma. Thank you very much for the space to discuss what we've been doing. But just so that you have an idea of what more of an idea of what I'm talking about, please feel free to reach out to scan this QR code, and this goes directly to the policy brief. And don't forget to, as it is with the times, like, share, subscribe the policy brief. We will be happy to have it circulated more, and I'll be happy also to take more questions in this session and later on. Again, thank you very much, Karma, and over to you.
Thank you, Rocky, for the fantastic presentation. And I guess most people know me, but I realized that I did not introduce myself in the beginning. So I will introduce myself now. For those who don't know me, my name is Karma Yangzom, and I am a principal environment specialist working in the environment group, actually with James, who is leading the circular economy work in the environment group within the climate change and sustainable development department. And I manage the air quality program. So I'm quite keen to talk also about the linkages with air pollution management. So now we can go into Q&A, and I think that there is already a couple of questions in the chat box. We have a first question from Pia on the waste to energy. Pia, can I invite you to raise your question? Or would you rather have me read it out? Okay, I think I read it out then. So his question is, how is waste to energy incineration being discussed by active participants at the Global Plastics Treaty? This is often a bit of a sensitive topic, disincentivizing circularity in a way to deal with low-value plastic, and interested to hear more. So this is really, as mentioned by Pia, it is, I guess, one of the pain points. A lot of the NGOs, they always, I guess, in some ways criticize ADB because we are financing some waste to energy plants in some of our member countries, but then we have our reasons why we do that. But perhaps I leave it to the expert, and maybe you can talk a little bit more and answer the question, Rocky. So I hand over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Karma, and thanks for that question, Pia. It is indeed a hot button topic, but I'd also like to say that it is currently in the discussions. So at this stage, just for some context, we are halfway through the global plastic treaty negotiations, and we are in the process of getting all the submissions from different state parties as well as observers, some NGOs, and they've included some parties have included the issue of incineration as well as waste to energy to be discussed in the formal negotiations happening this year. So if we look at the options papers and all the zero draft, revised zero draft that have come out, incineration has been identified as one of the issues that need to be addressed within the whole waste management control measure, the downstream life cycle part. This has frequently been lumped with the issues in open burning, so incineration, waste to energy, and how there should be safeguards or more regulations to ensure that they have safeguards to ensure that they are done in a sustainable manner using best available technologies and environmentally sound practices. Right now, I do not have the crystal ball to say if that's going to be in the final text, but it's certainly being discussed as one of the measures that need to be tackled along with other waste management solutions as well. So this could be included in the discussion for the control measures for waste management in the downstream life cycle approach. So there is active discussions, especially brought about by civil society, NGOs, but we have yet to see if some countries would have or would hold strong positions as to this, and that we'll have to find out in the next two negotiating rounds.
Okay, thank you so much, Rocky. And Karma, thank you for reading my question. I had trouble setting up my microphone earlier, but you beat me to reading the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Pia. And thank you, Rocky, for answering the question. But just to dwell a little bit on this topic of waste to energy, from your knowledge of plastic generation, plastic use, the scale at which it's happening, do you think that it's practical to like completely do away with waste to energy, or would certain conditions maybe warrant the need for such kind of plants? What do you think is realistic?
Yeah, thanks, Karma. Another hard question, but I'll take a stab on that. It's as a lawyer, I would always say it depends, right? It depends on the context of the country and the needs of the country. So there may be jurisdictions that might not need waste to energy facilities in the first place because they have like satisfactory waste management facilities in the first place that do not require waste to energy. So it really depends. There might be some countries, smaller island developing states, for example, that might have the need for this because it is the more efficient means. But it's also important to know that or to note that waste energy or incineration is just one of the potential waste management facilities or mechanisms in a whole suite of different ways to deal with it. So even if you look at ADB, energy policies, for example, it looks at waste to energy as more in the hierarchy, down in the hierarchy, and to ensure that we need to recycle first, promote 3Rs first, and all these waste management measures first before going to waste to energy or incineration as a waste management strategy. So it really depends on the context and the needs of each jurisdiction. But as to the connection with the plastics treaty, it would be good to have this discussion and actually have it in the text as well, because it would provide the safeguards that should be in place as to having the best available technology, how to address the emissions that it could pose, as well as ensuring environmentally sound management practices.
Yeah, thank you, Rocky. So I guess, again, similar, you sort of refer to this right now in your answer, but this is a question from Eva, our colleague Eva, in the dialogue that's going on. And I think you said there's a possibility that waste to energy will be mentioned, right, in the treaty. And what is the view of the Pacific SIDS? Regarding waste to energy and other options to meeting their climate and plastic pollution reduction in their particular context. So is there any like different views being shared by the SIDS countries?
Sure, I could share some insights, especially as to the negotiating processes on the position of the SIDS. As to my knowledge, they have not, or it's not been discussed, in particular, incineration or waste to energy as one of the issues that they want to look at specifically. But generally, Pacific SIDS in particular are looking at more stringent, stronger uh, production limitations, more upstream interventions. So this includes having potential bans or moratoriums for the production of primary plastic polymers, avoidable products. This has been the strong position of Pacific SIDS since the process started. Now, as to waste management, we have not gone to the granularity, the details as to what waste management schemes they are comfortable with, but they really want the parties to know that they have been suffering from increased plastic production as it goes to their shores, and it needs to stop. We need to stem and reduce plastic at source by having more interventions that target the upstream life cycle processes of plastics. So that's what's clear about the position of the Pacific SIDS throughout these negotiations.
Mm. That's, I guess, encouraging because I thought they may want to, defend kind of having more downstream measures as well. We have a question from Na Kong. Could I invite you to ask your question? Na Kong? Are you there? Maybe then I can just read it out, Rocky. So would you please share some key issues, concerns raised by representatives from different member countries during the GPT negotiation, given that they have different country contexts in terms of production, consumption, where did it go now, as well as infrastructure, conditions, technology, and advantages in dealing with waste. So I guess if you could give a little bit perspective of the range of concerns and issues that are being raised by the different countries.
Yeah.
Sure, Karma. Sorry?
Sorry,
Na?
couldn't be able
Yes,
to.
please, Na.
Yes,
Thanks,
please.
Kama. Thank you for your summarization. Yes. As Kama mentioned at the beginning, it's my great pleasure to attend in-person training in Manila. So I learned a lot from Rocky, and then I'm eager to learn more about these topics. So when I come back to PRCM, I get to start to research on some issues like I just mentioned, the differences between, the countries, member countries, because they have different, contexts. Just would like your kind guidance on that. So how the different countries to deal with, the same treaties and to get it on the ground. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Kong. It's nice to see you again here. The same interest in the plastics treaty negotiations as well. But this is a very loaded question that might need a whole day for discussion. But I'll try to go to a few key points as to what are the concerns that might arise and might play a bigger role in the next few negotiating rounds. The first one is on the definition of the plastic life cycle. So a group of countries led by oil-producing countries in the Middle East, including as well as other countries in Asia, including China and India, have the position that the life cycle, that is the definition and the scope of this plastics treaty, should start midstream, downstream, and should exclude the upstream processes of production because they contend that the plastic pollution is a waste management issue in the first place, and it's not a plastic production issue. Now, a lot of other countries, especially Pacific SIDS, as I've mentioned, a lot of developing countries in Asia and the Pacific contend that this should cover the entirety of plastic life cycle. And the key uh, intervention to really reduce plastic pollution in the first place is to limit production source. So there goes one of the main sticking points in the whole negotiations. The second one, I would say, is the bindingness of these provisions. So, for example, we have the control measures, we have EPR, as I've mentioned. Some countries contend that it should be mandatory, like all producers should be included here. And some countries would like to have this more catered to the national circumstances and to their capabilities. Some would even go as far as saying having it as voluntary and for encouraging these EPR or other control measures, PRs or whichever control measures in the first place. So it goes to the ambition of different countries and to have a level ground to for these ambitions to have a compromise approach, I guess, in the negotiation process as most treaties come. Now, as to the infrastructure conditions and technology provisions, infrastructure, there are provisions on waste management for developing and having more financing for infrastructure. But there's also an issue on technology transfer on mutually agreed terms. So if you've seen before in the means of implementation, technology transfer is one of the main strands for implementing as a means of implementation. And the term on mutually agreed terms is something that's also currently being discussed. How do you operationalize this? Is this developed countries giving providing resources for technology transfer to developing countries without any reservations, or what are these terms that are being discussed? So are some modalities that have to be fleshed out further in the next negotiations, or even not within the treaty text in future COP Conference of Party decisions. But this is something that we have to operationalize further as the technology transfer. So those are just some of the few sticking points, but there are a lot. We could go each provision, there are sticking points there, but hopefully within the next two negotiating rounds, we whittle it down to less controversial ones, and we just leave the other sticking points to the last part towards the end of the year to have a plastic treaty final text towards the end of the year. That's the goal.
Wow. Good luck to the negotiators. Looks like some challenging issues to agree on there. We have a question from our colleague Erin. Erin, can I invite you to ask your question? It's again in relation to the Global Plastics Treaty.
Sure. Thanks, Karma, and thanks, Rocky, for your excellent presentation as always. So, we've talked about this before, but can you tell us a little bit more about what the compliance and monitoring elements will be of the GPP? I think, one thing that a lot of people within the ADB community are flagging is, okay, well, does it have teeth? How will it compel countries to act? And that will help us to inform how ADB will support. So is there any, at this point, at this very early stage of the negotiations, what does it look like right now? What mechanisms are being proposed? And, I guess, how can we prepare for that? Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Erin. That's a very important question, and not just for ADB. I have met this question a number of times, even from developing member countries themselves. And it's important because that's the value added of this plastics treaty in the first place, to ensure that it's implemented and countries comply on the ground. Now, as to the implementation and compliance, it really goes to the suite of the means of implementation and implementation measures that I've mentioned. So, for example, we have this compliance mechanism. Firstly, it's important to note that multilateral environmental agreements, or MEAs, work to facilitate compliance instead of providing sanctions for erring or non-compliant parties. So this might be different from a trade agreement where you can have sanctions as to trade. For MEAs, you look at facilitating compliance, and this could be through capacity building, technology transfer, financing, technical assistance. Once we have that in place, and for example, once countries still are unable to comply, we have a separate body that are already in place in many MEAs. We call this a compliance committee. It could also be called an implementation committee. And what it does is it fosters and it facilitates compliance. Once there are reports or there are submissions that states are not compliant as to their own compliance, or other countries might report that they have not done their part, or based on their reports that they submit to the conference of parties, then the committee can take action. Now, in other multilateral agreements, for example, the CBT, the Convention on Biological Diversity, CITES on endangered species, the committee can take action such as verification missions, such as warnings, such as more capacity building to ensure that you fill the gap that's missing in the first place. And then some other modalities can be discussed in the COP decisions later on once we have the treaty in place. But there is a compliance mechanism that's part and parcel of most multilateral environmental agreements. They try their best to facilitate compliance generally without having sanctioning powers, as most countries might not be comfortable having or giving the jurisdiction to sanction them in the first place. So that's the reality of multilateral environmental agreements. We try to foster compliance, facilitate compliance up to an extent, and it's up to the countries to comply once we give them all the available resources and actions that they need to actually do it. So yes, that's the reality of MEAs, and that's how it is in the international law.
Thank you, Rocky. So a question from Pia. Pia, can I invite you? Is your mic working?
Sure, yeah. Yes, it is. Yes, I was curious about how much excitement do you see from governments with regards to the Global Plastics Treaty versus the climate negotiations? I know there are different topics and such, and I don't know if you've been able to go to these climate negotiations, but I'm curious to hear about what the appetite is. For me, I've always found waste more compelling because it's something we see every day, whereas like climate change, the impact can happen many years from now, or it happens right now, but there's not really like a direct personal linkage and stuff at times. So if you're able to answer this question, great. If not, that's okay. Don't worry about it.
Of course, yeah. It's a great question. And as I always say, it always depends on the government, right? So there are some governments which really hold the treaty and its implications in high regard, especially as to ensuring that there are limitations, for example, more control measures, stronger control measures for production, for instance. And there are governments that would really like to focus on specific parts of the life cycle that is being discussed in the plastics treaty negotiations, the downstream parts. So it really depends on which governments you're looking at. But I see, on a general sense, a commitment from all to have an instrument that is internationally legally binding to all countries. So once the final text is up for adoption, countries will necessarily have to ratify it, and that will be part of their national law, if you will. They will have to implement it, right? So countries have already resolved to have that process. This goes to show in the UNEA resolutions, in all these INC or the negotiating committee rounds. But as to the content, it really depends on the country as if they get excited about this or not. But there is also opportunity to discuss more issues, to discuss more modalities, and that will be after the GPT is adopted. If in the climate change negotiations you've been following, there are COP events every year, right? complement like the UNFCCC, the main framework for climate change, the convention. So we have these opportunities to have these COP, and these COPs would have decisions on specific issues. For example, the last COP for climate change, we had the global stocktake issues, all these things. And these are things that might be discussed later on once we have more needs and points of improvement for the Global Plastics Treaty at a later stage. So there are opportunities to enhance and sharpen the modalities further on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pia, for the question, and thank you, Rocky. So I guess in relation to what you just mentioned, I was curious to know if plastics features in any of the countries' NDCs. I know you're talking about the Plastics Treaty, but in relation to the Paris Agreement, is there any linkages with NDCs and the climate commitments of countries?
Thanks, Karma. And very important question. As of now, I have not seen or I have not checked yet specific NDCs on plastics, but it makes sense for some countries because NDCs might look at specific industries where they want to have targets as to their carbon emissions, right? So I'm not sure if there is an NDC example for specific country on their plastics, targeting the plastics industry in the first place, but it would make sense if it includes an NDC in particular for production processes for fossil fuel, for those that are looking at polymerization and materials that would be the material base for plastics in the first place. So I have not seen any in particular, but it might be good to look at it further as well. Good opportunity for the NDCs to look at this and to update it as we go further.
Yes, absolutely. Because I mean, as you mentioned, the numbers, it does lead to a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So managing that can then be a component in the NDCs. And since the NDCs are constantly being updated, so that's a good opportunity. I agree. So I had mentioned earlier that I am working on air quality management. So perhaps, Rocky, I know we are coming to the end of the session, but if you could talk a little bit more about the linkages with managing air pollution, and what are your thoughts in terms of where you see opportunities for me in my work and the circular economy team, to work together where you're managing, you're working on circular economy, managing waste, and on the other hand, at the same time, we can also work on reducing air pollution. So maybe you can share your thoughts.
Sure, Karma, thanks for that question. And indeed, it's all interrelated. Plastic pollution, all this pollution, climate change, air pollution. In particular for air pollution, I mean the drivers for climate change and the air pollution are somewhat similar, and some of the solutions for climate change would necessarily have be a solution as for addressing air pollution as well. I've mentioned in one of my first few slides the promotion of low carbon technologies, and those technologies, best available technologies that would have appropriate standards. And this could include having standards for air pollution in the first place. It could go looking at standards that would limit greenhouse gases, but also all the emissions, the PM 2.5, all the emissions that might be addressed by having appropriate standards, air quality monitoring, all these safeguards in place. So this would really hit like climate change issues as well as air pollution issues, which are very important, especially in this region. So there's a lot of opportunities to look at where they link together, but especially in the national action plans in line with the NDCs, it's important to have the linkages more clear so the interventions could be done in a more targeted manner, looking at the impacts of reducing plastic pollution and its delivering co-benefits for air pollution as well as climate change.
Yes, so lots of opportunities to work together. And since I think we are almost finishing, I have another question, which is with regard to the issue on the just transition. And I'm also working with the team in ADB on updating the safeguard policy. And a lot of the questions that we get from the stakeholders and the civil society is on the negative impacts where there could be risks for, job losses and things like that when we are managing the waste and making everything much more systematic and formalized. Could be that the informal people working informally in the waste sector, they could, lose their livelihood. So I assume that the just transition that you mentioned is tackling a little bit of this. So maybe you could explain a little bit more on the just transition.
Yes, sure, Karma. Quickly, just transition is playing a big role as well in this processes. There are representation from different players, especially in the informal waste sector, waste pickers, indigenous peoples, women, children, and youth, all these groups that are disproportionately impacted by waste harm. As to the discussions itself in the plastics treaty and the text, there is actually a control measure on just transition, and this might include the discussions on formalizing the informal waste sector to ensure that they are included within the whole framework process, having the safeguards in place. You have the labor standards, you have the insurance, all these safeguards that are important to ensure that they have a life and a job that is up to par with other formal jobs and occupations. So there is discussions there. This might be included. This will likely be included. I mean, I think just transition is one of the things that would certainly feature within the Global Plastics Treaty. As to the specific provisions, we'll have to see. But once it's there, it will have to be implemented through the national action plans, and these national action plans will have indicators to ensure that how much have been formalized, all these things. So there is definitely an opportunity to ramp up the provisions on just transition to ensure that it has actual impact on the ground, and especially to those target people within the sector working within the informal waste sector as well as other marginalized communities. So yes, there is opportunity definitely, Karma.
Great. Thank you, Rocky. I think now we have come to the end of the session, and for the information of our participants, I think colleagues have made a couple of posts in the chat box where there are links to some papers and knowledge briefs which have been written by Rocky. So please feel free to download these documents to learn more about the topic. Thank you so much, Rocky. I think this was a really informative and useful session. And I think this whole work around circular economy and plastics is very much in line with ADB's priorities on the climate shift and the private sector shift, and also all the social and environmental benefits that are going to come out of the work or are already coming out of the work that you are doing. And overall, I think this is really impactful, meaningful work. And I got to see, through some of the participants and the speakers and the videos that were shown in the training a couple of weeks ago. So this is really, impactful work that you guys are doing. And, congratulations to everybody in the team. And in your presentation today, again, I've learned, so much more. And it's great that you have some very concrete and specific recommendations on how ADB can help to, move forward this agenda and help to create the enabling environment, for the implementation and rolling out of the plastics treaty once it gets signed. Is it next year, early next year?
Here, that's the goal.
Yeah, so you have, and you've provided all the different solutions at the upstream, the midstream, the downstream, and I think the knowledge is pretty much there, and it's a matter of, I think, packaging of the different solution, figuring out the financing, and then really kind of building the capacity of the member countries and working together. So thank you very much again, Rocky. This has been a really interesting session, and I've learned a lot. And I look forward to, you know, continuing to work with the circular economy team and trying to expand it also to the air quality agenda that we are trying to promote within the same team. So with that, thank you. And thank you to all our organizers, our colleagues behind the scenes, Eva, Erin, Ice. Thank you so much. And to our participants. So this is not the end of the circular economy series. There will be many more coming. I think what I was told was it could go on forever. So please stay tuned. There are many more exciting sessions coming up. Thank you very much.
Very
Bye-bye.
much. Bye bye.